Hello and welcome to another Bard's Tale. Again we hear the tales of Tibetan folklore. There were so many I left out last week that I wanted to tell more of these tales. 3 seems to be the recurring number for how many tales I tell each week, and it seems to be of good length, so here are another 3 Tibetan folk tales. Now, the first tale is called The Wise Carpenter. Long ago, in the kingdom known as Snelong, ruled the king Gendong. The king died and left his throne to his heir and son, Genchog. Amongst the people he ruled were 2 men, one a painter, the other a carpenter. Both were the best at what they did, but they were the most bitter of enemies. A thought struck the painter one day, a dastardly plot. Excitedly he approached King Genchog. Last night as I slept, I was visited by an angel, and this angel was sent by your father. The angel brought me to heaven, and I was awestruck by the massive amount of wealth your father had accrued for himself. He gave me a letter to give to you. It speaks of the carpenter who dwells here in this city. King Genchog opened the letter and read, "My son, I am in heaven and very wealthy. I have much, but still yearn for one thing. I wish to build a temple to the gods, but there are no good carpenters here. I want you to send the best carpenter you have to heaven. The painter who brings this to you knows what I mean, as I sent him." King Genchog, astounded at the letter, said, "This must be my father's letter, for it is like him to want to build a temple to the gods. I must see that I grant his wish." Calling the carpenter to him, he said, "My father in heaven wishes me to send the best carpenter in the city to heaven, to build a temple to the gods. He asks for you." The carpenter thought this strange. This must be a scheme of the painter to be rid of me. "Very well," the carpenter said, "but how am I to get to your father?" King Genchog turned to the painter and asked the same question. "He is to bring all the tools he needs and sit on them, as wood is piled around him and set on fire. The smoke which rises from the pyre will lift the carpenter to heaven." The carpenter nodded in agreement. "I agree, but I want to start from the field of my choice." The king, accepting the carpenter's decision, gave him 7 days to prepare. The carpenter returned home to his wife, clearly upset. "The painter has fixed a scheme to kill me, and I have but 7 days before I am burned alive. So we must get to work, for I will dig a tunnel from this house to the field where I am to be burned." The wife agreed, and for 7 days they dug the tunnel, finishing it only barely before the deadline, putting a few sticks over the opening where the carpenter was to sit atop his tools. As soon as the 7th day had reached its end, the king called for the carpenter. He ordered his people to bring him much wood and oil. The carpenter sat on his tools as the wood was piled around him, and set alight. Once the fire was big enough that the carpenter could no longer be seen, he pulled away the sticks and hurried down the tunnel. Watching the burning pile, the painter commented, "Look, there he goes, straight up to heaven on the smoke." The people gathered looked, and took it for truth. Now the carpenter hid in a secret room in his house, washing himself each day, and dressing himself in clothes like the gods wear. After 3 long months, the carpenter put on these garments, and with skin white as lily, due to the constant washing, he came before the king, bearing a letter from his father. King Genchog read the letter. "My dear son Genchog, I hear you are a good ruler, and that you rule with wisdom and kindness. The carpenter you sent me has finished the temple beautifully, and he must be rewarded for his work when he returns to you. Now that the temple is complete, I require the best painter in your kingdom to come to me in the same way as the carpenter, so the temple may be painted as beautifully as it was constructed." The carpenter told King Genchog of how rich and great his father was in heaven, and of many wondrous adventures in the sky. The king gave him the riches he was allegedly owed, and called for the painter. "The carpenter has returned from heaven, where he has finished his work, and has brought a letter from my father, asking for you to paint this temple." The painter looked at the carpenter with his godly garments and his white skin, and half believed that he had actually been to heaven. The painter agreed, grabbed all his tools, and waited the 7 days thinking of what was to come. When all was ready, and the wood was piled about the painter as he sat on his tools, the carpenter called for a large band to play as the painter ascended to heaven. So they played loudly with drums, horns, and cymbals, drowning out the sound of the roaring flames. As soon as the fire reached the painter sitting in the middle of the pyre, he began to scream and yell as he was burned alive, but the music was so great he couldn't be heard. So, in the end, the painter really did go to heaven. This tale is called The Story of the Two Devils. In times past, and in a land so high it would make most boys and girls tired if they tried to run and play, was a great tableland surrounded by green forest. Atop this tableland was a large city surrounded by several smaller settlements, all ruled by a king who had 7 sons. The 7 sons went out to play in the forest one day, and they did until they stumbled across a beautiful girl tending to her yak. Asking who she was, she said she was the daughter of a king who ruled west of here, and that the yak had wandered from her, so she ran after it to bring it back. The 7 sons were enamored, and so proposed to her on the spot that she become the wife of all 7 of them, as was the custom of the country. Unbeknownst to the sons, the girl wore a deceitful skin, for she was a she-devil in disguise, and her yak was her husband, disguised as well. Devils are able to change their form whenever they choose, usually to mischievous ends. She drove the yak away and returned to the kingdom to her 7 new husbands. But as each year passed, so too did each of the sons, beginning with the eldest, until only the youngest remained. He was now ill and close to death. The headmen of the villages in the kingdom spoke at length about what could be done to save the prince's life, shaking their heads and muttering that this was all very queer. Queer indeed that the 6 brothers before him had all died despite the wise men's treatments. They eventually came to the conclusion that only a fortune teller could discover what the matter was with the final son, and so they sought the aid of a local fortune teller and quickly relayed the story of the 7 sons to him. The fortune teller said he would lie down and sleep on the matter to receive a vision on how to treat this matter. The wise men understood, and were expectant to hear about the vision tomorrow. But in actuality, the fortune teller had no idea what to do. He was no teller of fortunes, and had never had a vision in his life. The false fortune teller asked his wife what to do that night. "You've lied about this sort of thing before, so it won't hurt us to lie some more. You've come out fairly well every other time, so I'm sure you can fix up a plan for this affair." Comforted, but only slightly, the fortune teller fell asleep. The next morning, when the 4 wise men came, the fortune teller said, "I had a fine vision. I will get my black clothes and hat and read prayers for you. We will return to your prince with these charms and make everything all right." He took a big rosary and the skull of a hog and traveled to the palace with the 4 wise men. When they arrived, the disguised she-devil didn't know what to think, but became concerned that this fortune teller may sniff her out. The fortune teller placed a samba torma at the head of the sick man, along with the hog skull, and covered them all with a cloth. When the she-devil left the room, the prince became stronger and fell asleep. The fortune teller, terrified that he may have done some irreversible harm to the prince, prepared to leave for fear of the king's wrath. The door to the room, however, was locked, and he couldn't escape. A staircase led from the room upwards, and so he travelled upstairs, only to fall into a dark hole where the she-devil stood, and landed atop the he-devil in the guise of a yak. The yak bucked wildly, and the fortune teller held on to its horns for fear of being flung off with rosary beads in hand. "The man knows us all right," cried out the yak. "He jumped on me, and now beats me to death with his rosary charms. What shall I do?" His wife replied, "He knows me too, but I'm too terrified to help. By morning they will call the people together to get rid of us." The devils thought they would be burned alive, assaulted with thrown stones, or any other terrible torture if they were discovered. The man managed to roll off the yak, and grabbed his hog skull and samba torma, and began to read prayers to the sun. The sun began to noticeably recover, hearing the devils crying. The prince the next morning called for the wise men, and had them call for all people to bring weapons and wood. The next morning the people gathered about a large pile of wood, and the fortune teller saddled the yak, which he then rode all over the city till he came to the pile of wood, whereupon he hit the yak across the head with the hog skull 3 times, saying, "I want to see the real body of this yak." The yak turned at once into a he-devil with a hideous face. His 2 upper teeth hung down his breast, and the 2 lower teeth extended to his forehead. He was swiftly slain by the people with swords. The fortune-teller then called for the woman to come. She was dragged out screaming before the fortune-teller, who struck her in the same manner with the hog skull. She became at once a hideous thing, resembling her husband. She was stoned to death, and the body of her and her husband were thrown upon the now burning pile of wood. Great honor was granted to the fortune-teller, who returned to the still sick prince. The prince quickly recovered afterwards, and said, "Whatever you wish, ask, and I will give it to you." The fortune-teller thought a moment, and said, "Well, I would like some of those wooden rings used to lead yaks by their noses." He wanted these because his wife told him he made them poorly, and so the grateful prince granted him 100 rings, and enough goods to make 7 yak loads on the way home. His wife saw him coming and ran to meet him. That night the fortune-teller told his wife of his adventure. "And this is all you have? Some dried cheese, meat, and a few rings for the yak?" she said, scolding him soundly. She wrote a vicious letter to the prince, informing him that he may not be reading this letter today, had not her husband chosen to help him. The next day the prince visited the fortune-teller and his wife, and granted the fortune-teller half the kingdom as proper payment. The final tale is a small one, called The Decision of the Official as to who owned the 100 ounces of silver. There stood a tiny hut on the side of a mountain owned by an old blind woodcutter and his dutiful son, who cared greatly for him. The son went out one day to gather wood, but on the way back he stumbled down a steep path where he found a small leather bag. Inside were 10 pieces of 10-ounce silver chunks. This was a great fortune, and would mean a lot for him and his father. He hurried home and told his father of what he found. The son wanted to keep the bag for them, to ease their way of life. But the father said, "No, we must be honest. Take it up to the headman of the village, and tell him of it." The son understood, and told the headman of the bag he had found, and how much was in it. The headman would try to discover who the bag belonged to. One day, a man walked in, stating that he had lost his bag of silver. The headman, remembering the bag the son of the woodcutter had brought him, called for him to bring the bag of silver. But once the man found he was going to get away with his silver so easily, he told the official he had 20 pieces in the bag. He accused the boy of stealing 10 of them. The headman quietly asked one of his servants to go and hear the woodcutter's version of this tale. When the servant returned with the other side of the tale, the headman understood that the man before him was a liar. The man who claimed the silver was his, and that the boy stole from him, stood expectantly before the headman. "This silver belongs to the son of the woodcutter, so it mustn't be yours. Yours had 20 pieces, and his only had 10. You will have to look elsewhere for yours, as I will let the boy keep his to support his old father."